So the blog post here is on spirituality and science, the way of the heart versus the way of the mind. And I'm trying here to sort of juxtapose the different approaches between the two so that we can see them as being complementary instead of being enemies. There's been this sort of history of religion and science being enemies of each other. So, what I have here is that what we really have is that spirituality and science deal with different aspects of reality. A spiritual person is someone who has the ability and interest and orientation to try to tune in to the unseen world, the hidden dimension of life, the metaphysical, right? That which sort of goes beyond the usual empirical world of the five senses. And what we would today, many of us would regard as being sort of the energetic basis to reality behind the physical world. And so it's a certain form of knowing, all right? It involves a certain way of knowing, a way of perceiving and connecting and relating and knowing reality in a way that goes beyond mere logic and reason. And so it's its own type of empiricism, but of a different nature, one that goes beyond the five senses. And there's a lot involved with this. But a key thing is that feeling plays a key role here in the way of knowing in the spiritual aspect. It's often been said that the shamans of old would feel the world around them, whereas we in the West, in the modern world, we just see and observe the world. We so much relate and engage to reality itself through the head, through the visual, through the eyes. Whereas more indigenous people do it by feeling, that their sense of consciousness and awareness isn't just simply visual and up here in the head, but it shifts lower down into the body and it's more of a sensing and feeling of the world around them. All right. And that's what's meant by that. And I remember reading in a book once a native First Nations elder speaking to Carl Jung, and he said, "Oh, you white people, you just think with your heads, whereas we think with our hearts." And that's a key thing. That's a key component of a difference between spirituality and science, is a different way of knowing and relating to reality. Now, another key aspect here is that spirituality involves a different way of relating to reality. It's more of a sense of relating to reality in a way through of connectedness, because in order to know the world out there, right, you know it through connecting with it, through an attunement, a becoming one with what it is, and then feeling through compassion, through this connectedness with something else, that is how you then know what it's like or know what's going on with an animal, with another person, feeling the world around you, your environment. That knowledge comes through connectedness, all right, and at oneness, and attunement, right? That's a key thing. Whereas the scientific empirical approach is all about an objective mode of consciousness, of setting yourself as being separate and apart and distinct from your environment, as the detached observer, right, and relating to it as all as objects separate from yourself. So it involves a way of knowing that entails a disconnection, a separation between yourself as, quote, subject and the world out there as objects, right? It's a different approach. And as with anything, there's pros and cons to everything, all right? And there is definitely a place for that. We do need a time and place of being the detached observer, all right? Otherwise, you could get so caught up through that connectedness that it dominates your whole sense of self and reality, and you're just taken over by the reality of the other so that there's no you, and it just dominates your sense of self. But then on the other hand, where we are so separate and disconnected from the other, from the world, and being objective, right, it can also be a very alienating, isolating, very limiting place in another kind of a way. I mean, there's strengths and weaknesses to both. And the key thing is being aware of which mode of consciousness you're working with. I really like this essay, or well, it's a book that was written, I think in the 70s by Arthur Dykman. I think it's called The Observing Self, and I forget the title of it, but just so has resonated with me, and I've used it ever since, is that we have two modes of consciousness, right? Two different ways of perceiving and relating to reality. He called it the objective mode and the receptive mode. And the objective mode is what most of us are accustomed to. We've been conditioned into this way of knowing as being the only legitimate way of knowing. And it is the way of knowing that is very much identified with the way of science, empiricism, empirical observation of the world, of objects being the detached observer, and then rational analysis of the component parts, okay, through the use of logic. And very useful, very important. We need it, but it's not the whole story, right? That's the whole blooming problem here. We have in the West so absolutized that empiricist rationalistic approach as being the only way of knowing at the expense of all other ways of knowing. And we have dismissed the more intuitive way that we have belittled as being merely subjective and therefore meaningless. And yet, therein lies the source of meaning, really. It is the basis of all meaning, is by creating and establishing connectedness, connections between things. That is what brings things meaning. And so there's a place for both.